මිළඟට අප සූදානම් වන්නේ අද දිනේදී මුඛ්‍ය දේශනය සඳහා යොමු වන්නට. ලාංකේය නූතන සාහිත්‍ය, ලාංකේය සිනමාව, ආසියාතික සිනමාව, ආසියාතික සංනිවේදන සිද්ධාන්ත, නව විචාර න්‍යාය විෂයෙහි ඉමහත් කීර්තියක් දේශීයව මෙන්ම ජාත්‍යන්තරවද දිනාගත් සුවිශිෂ්ට ශාස්ත්‍රාලීය පෞරුෂයකටයි අද දිනේදී පැවරී තිබෙන්නේ මේ සභාවේ මුඛ්‍ය දේශනය කරන්නට. ඒ සුවිශිෂ්ට ශාස්ත්‍රාලීය පෞරුෂය හඳුන්වා දෙන්නට අපේ ඇරයුම ලැබෙනවා මහාචාර්ය ඕජී දයාරත්න මහතා.
கண்ணை கவரக்கூடிய அழகிய நடனத்தை வழங்கிய மாணவர்களுக்கு நன்றிகள். அதனைத் தொடர்ந்து அமெரிக்காவின் கவாட் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் இருந்து பேராசிரியர் விமல் திசாநாயக்க என்று எங்களுடன் இணைந்து கலாச்சார கற்கைகள், சமூக விஞ்ஞானங்கள் மற்றும் மானிடவியல் இணைதல் என்ற தலைப்பில் சிறப்புரை ஆற்றுவது உண்மையில் பெருமைக்குரிய விடயமாகும். அந்த வகையில் பேராசிரியர் திசாநாயக்காவை தனது சிறப்புரைக்கு அழைப்பதற்கு முன் பேராசிரியர் ஓஜி தயாரத்ன அவர்களை இன்றைய முக்கிய பேச்சாளரை அறிமுகப்படுத்துவதற்கு தயவுடன் அழைக்கின்றோம்.
It is indeed an honor for us to have Emeritus Professor Vimal Disanayake joining us today from the University of Hawaii, USA, to give the keynote address under the topic of Cultural Studies when Humanities and Social Sciences Meet. Before inviting Professor Disanayake for his keynote address, it is my pleasure in inviting Professor O.J. Dayaratna to introduce today's keynote speaker.
Venerable Mahasangha, Honorable Chairman UGC, Honorable Vice Chairman UGC, Honorable Chairperson of the Standing Committee, distinguished guests, invitees, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great honor that I introduce Professor Vimal Disanayake, the keynote speaker at this Centenary Conference of Humanities and Social Sciences University Education in Sri Lanka. A veteran poet, a critic, Professor Disanayake obtained his Bachelor of Arts Honours degree from the University of Peradeniya, Master of Arts from the University of Pennsylvania, and Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge. He was also awarded the Doctor of Philosophy, Doctor of Literature from the University of Kelaniya for his scholarly work. Professor Disanayake served as a Director of Cultural Studies at the University of Hawaii, jointly sponsored by the University of Hawaii and the East West Center. He has served as an advisor to the UNESCO. He is a recipient of the Fulbright Rockefeller Fellowship and was invited to be the Wei Lung Distinguished Professor at the Chinese University in Hong Kong. One of the leading scholars of Asian cinema and Asian communication theory, Professor Disanayake is the author of over 45 scholarly books in English published by Oxford, Cambridge, Duke, New York State, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois University Presses, and Routledge. He has also published a large number of scholarly books in Sinhala. Founding editor of East West Film Journal, he serves an editorial advisor to a large number of prestigious international academic journals dealing with cinema, communication, and cultural theory, as well as International Encyclopedia of Communication. He has won national awards for his books in Sinhala as well as in English, and he was given the prestigious Lifetime Honorary Award of Sahitya Ratna. Professor Disanayake also received Desabandhu Award from the state of Sri Lanka. In this year, Professor Disanayake was awarded the prestigious Asian Communication Award for 2021 by the Asian Media Information and Communication Center in the Philippines on 4th of December. This award is given to the most outstanding communication scholars in Asia who have excelled in their chosen pursuits. This honor was conferred on Professor Disanayake primarily in recognition of his path-breaking work in the domain of Asian theories of communication and Asian cinema. Professor Disanayake is one of the leading bilingual poets. He has published 8 volumes of poetry in Sinhala, for which he has been honored with numerous awards. His English poetry has been published in journals such as Hawaii Review, Kaimana, Bamboo Ridge, Cambridge Review, and Pound. His English book of poetry, The Kingfisher, was published very recently. Professor Disanayake was invited to keynote speeches at numerous conferences held in countries and territories such as Germany, Canada, United States, India, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. He is currently an affiliate professor at the University of Hawaii and an honorary professor at the Open University of Hong Kong. Professor Disanayake has had the rare distinction of serving both as professor of Sinhala and professor of English. Let me now invite warmly Professor Vimal Disanayake to deliver his keynote address. Thank you very much.
විද්වත් සභාවෙන් අවසරයි. මගේ දේශනේ මා කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වන්නේ ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන්. නමුත් ඊට ප්‍රථමයෙන් එක් වාක්‍යයකින් සාරාංශයක් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න කැමැති ඒ දේශනේ පිළිබඳව. අද අපි සමරන්නේ මානව ශාස්ත්‍ර හා සමාජ විද්‍යා සංස්ථාපනය කිරීමේ වැදගත්කමයි. එම නිසා මානව ශාස්ත්‍ර හා සමාජ විද්‍යා එක්තැන්වීමෙන් බිහි වූ සංස්කෘති අධ්‍යයන යන නව විෂය පිළිබඳයි මා අද මේ සාකච්ඡා කරන්නේ. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I must thank all of you for deciding to attend this very important educational and cultural event. I must also tender an apology. I was hoping to deliver this lecture in person, and so did the organizers of this event. But unfortunately, the vagaries and the capriciousnesses of the corona epidemic are such that it was not possible at all. I must thank the organizers of this event for asking me to be the keynote speaker, especially Professor Premakumara De Silva and Dr. Asha Fernandez. I must also thank Mr. Korlagamage for handling the communication and the technological parts of this endeavor. Now, the topic I've chosen this morning is cultural studies when humanities and social sciences meet. Why did I select this topic? There are four main reasons for that. First, we are celebrating the establishment of humanities and social sciences at the tertiary level. And these 100 years ago that happened. So it's a very important milestone in the development of higher education in Sri Lanka. So the topic demands that treatment because humanities and social sciences are so important in the forward march of higher education in our country. The second is that I was, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, I was the director of the Cultural Studies program at the East West Center, Hawaii for a number of years. And during that period, I organized seminars on a bi-weekly basis that brought very many of the outstanding scholars in the field. And also, annually, I gave a course of lectures at the University of Hawaii to graduate students, that is MA and PhD students, on cultural studies and modern critical theory. So that's the second reason. The third reason is, although there are scholars in Sri Lanka who are interested in cultural studies, it is still to gain the kind of attraction that it deserves. So therefore, I would like to make a case for cultural studies as a worthwhile discipline. And fourthly, I was trained both in the social sciences and the humanities. I was trained as a social scientist at University of Pennsylvania, and I was trained as a humanist at Cambridge University. In addition, as was mentioned, I published about 40 books in English, and of those, some are in the humanities and some are in social sciences. Therefore, for these four reasons, I decided to select the topic cultural studies when humanities and social sciences meet. Now, humanities and social sciences are two of the most important modes of inquiry. But the humanities have a longer history. Now, when we say humanities, we are talking of literature, philosophy, history, and so on, language studies, which have had a very long and distinguished history. But this is not to say that the social sciences are negligible, although they are of more recent origin. They still have contributed significantly to modern scholarship. So both are important. So we need to understand the relationship between humanities and the social sciences. Normally, there's a tendency to think of social sciences and humanities as antagonistic, as antithetical, which is true so far as it goes. But it is very important to keep in mind the fact that there are certain alliances that could be forged. It's very important to bear in mind the fact that they can be friends. And what we see in the emergence of cultural studies is that humanities and social sciences have come together to create a new discipline. So my point is, humanities and social sciences are not necessarily enemies. They can also be friends, and cultural studies proves that. So that becomes important. Okay, so we have on the one hand the social sciences, which are based on natural sciences. It's very important to bear in this mind. When the humanities, social sciences emerged, they were based on natural sciences. In fact, the earlier social scientists were referred to as social physicists, or social science was referred to as social physics. And physics and biology produced earlier models for social science scholars. But in more recent times, there has emerged what is called interpretive social science, which is a mixture of humanities and social science. So on the one hand, you have what is called positivistic social science. On the other, you have interpretive social science. Let me bring out the differences between the two. The positive social sciences can be called, or they valorize objectivism. They are making a case for neutrality, passivity, statistical manipulation, general laws, causality. These are very important factors because they are also what you find in the natural sciences. On the other hand, when you take the interpretive social sciences, they are much more close to the humanities because they are talking in terms of interpretation rather than law, meaning rather than law. And they are talking in terms of text and textual presentations. So therefore, you have the humanities and the social sciences, and recent times, the interpretive social science has emerged. There are a number of scholars who have contributed significantly to this. For instance, if you take an anthropologist like Clifford Geertz, the American anthropologist, he sought to bring anthropology closer to literature. He saw anthropological texts as literary texts. The way you study a literary text is the way you study ethnography. And not only that, in his own writings, he sort of adopted the styles of master stylists like Henry James. So he sought to bring anthropology and literature close to each other. So that is an important aspect. Or you take another anthropologist like Victor Turner, who was talking in terms of rituals and liminality and so on. And he again underlines the importance of interpretive social science. Or if you take another sociologist, Erving Goffman, his whole theory is based on the idea of all the world's a stage and we are all actors, we are play acting all the time. So that allows him a kind of framework with which to analyze modern society. Or if you take a historian, or better still, a meta-historian like Hayden White, what you find is Hayden White making the argument that historical texts are very close to literary texts because normally history is seen as a factual description of what happened in the past. But in modern times, people are arguing against that concept and saying that we need to see history as a form of narrative. There are different narratives of a given past, so that it's a narrativized event, narrativized text that we have. And therefore, what better way of studying narrativized text than making use of literary tools of analysis? So therefore, Hayden White brought in ideas of romance, tragedy, comedy, satire, and employment to understand the way that history and literature have come together. So here then you have very interesting situation where you have the positivistic social science still very dominant, playing a very important role, but at the same time you have challenges to it from the interpretive social, which is much closer to the humanities. But there are connections between the two as well, despite the antagonisms. Now, there have been certain supporting forces which encourage this. One is the whole idea of ordinary philosophy promoted by Wittgenstein and J.L. Austin and so on, who valorize the idea of ordinary life and ordinary speech. And that has influenced the interpretive scientists. Thinkers who promote interpretive social science are heavily influenced by Wittgenstein and J.L. Austin and their pupils. Or you have phenomenology, especially thinkers like Merleau-Ponty pointed out the importance of consciousness, the body, subjectivity in understanding the relationship between human beings, nature, and society. That relationship has to be understood in terms of subjectivism. So therefore, the interpretive social science becomes extremely important. Or if you take someone like Charles Taylor, the famous Canadian philosopher, he's talking about human beings as self-interpreting animals. In other words, we are not like a piece of iron or inanimate object. We are self-interpreting animals. So that when we study human beings, we cannot adopt bodily the kind of tools and the methodologies that physicists have adopted in their work. So therefore, there's a very strong case to be made for interpretive social science. So when the interpretive social science was promoted, there were three reactions. One, some embraced it wholeheartedly. They said, this is a wonderful idea, and they embraced it. There were others who totally rejected it, saying that this was superficial, this lacked academic rigor, analytical rigor, and they rejected it. And there was a third group, by far, I think the largest group, which sought to adapt that to need one's own imperatives and investments and so on, so that it gradually became absorbed by the establishment as well. So that becomes important. Let me just take one example. Let's take the concept of the body. Now, in positivist sociology, the body did not figure very significantly. You had reference to the body, but it was the disembodied agency that was important. Or body was seen as opposed to the soul or the mind. But in interpretive social science, the body becomes extremely important. Merleau-Ponty made a very special argument regarding the centrality of body in human understanding. So the body becomes important. And especially in more recent times, with the work of, say, anthropologists like Mary Douglas or social thinkers like Michel Foucault, the body becomes something that is at the center. It was brought from the margins to the center of intellectual analysis, especially in the case of Foucault. He pointed out that power and the inscription of power on body, the inscription of cultural imperatives on the body are very, very important, and we need to examine that very closely. So you get that the centrality of the body emerging. And when you take giants of social science like Durkheim and Max Weber and so on, they didn't pay much attention to the body. But it's only more recent times with Foucault and others that it became important, and it has played a very important role in the resurgence of interpretive social science. Let me just give you an example. In my literary analysis, I sometimes use the concept of biopoetics. By biopoetics, I mean the use of biology, the body, as a way of an aesthetic category, aesthetic mode of analysis. Let me give you one example. Let's take a Sinhala poem from the Salini Sandeshe. Sisivana wana ingasunga gata haki mitina, nisipulu lukulu ria sakayuru tisaratana, disirana liev ru siriyut epurangana, asipia helena pamanin noveti devangana. Now in this poem, if you understand Sinhalese, you realize that it is an extolling of female beauty in hyperbolic terms. It's almost equated to divine beauty. But something very interesting happens in the fourth line. There's a kind of self-cancellation, self-diminution going on, because the poet says they are not goddesses because they blink, because the standard belief is that goddesses don't blink, but these women blink, so therefore they are not goddesses. So what's happening in the last line is an act of self-diminution, but also an act of self-enhancement. So that is what you would call it's a very interesting deconstructive move. So you have self-debasement leading to self-enhancement. So this is just one example. I can quote many others to show that biopoetics becomes extremely important. So what happens is you still have the positivistic social science playing a very important role, but you also have the emergence of the interpretive social science with its focus on meaning, values, action, and so on. And you have modes of inquiry, such as symbolic interactionism, ethnomethodology, phenomenological sociology, constructivism, existential psychology, and others, which show the power, the influence of the interpretive social science. So you got to keep in mind when we talk about the relationship and the alliances between the humanities and the social sciences, here is a very good example of that. Now, things have gone even further because during the last 30 years or so, we have witnessed what can be profitably termed a literary turn in both the humanities and the social sciences. By that, what I mean is that literature and literary theory has begun to influence even disciplines like geography. So that becomes extremely important. So therefore, rise of literary theory, there's a literary turn. Let's take some examples. Let's take anthropology. In anthropology, traditionally, anthropologists went out to remote villages and studied very scientifically. They observed very scientifically, and they wrote their findings in a very scientific manner and so on. And it was seen as social science. But in more recent times, anthropological texts are seen as literary texts. Writing becomes extremely important. It's not only field work, but desk work is as important. The question of writing becomes central to the endeavor of anthropologists. So anthropological texts are seen as literary texts. A good example is Clifford Beers that I referred to earlier. In his work, he sees anthropology texts as literary texts, and he himself is a master stylist, and he follows the example of, say, Henry James and others in composing his sentences. But he brought literature and anthropology together. That's one example. But younger anthropologists have taken that further and established much more closer links between anthropology and literature. So you have anthropology, in anthropology, the rise of literary theory. Or you take another example, history. As I said, history is traditionally understood as an objective account, but now history is seen as a narrative. You can have many narratives of the same past, right? So it's a narrative text. And Hayden White uses literary techniques. He has 4 categories. The categories are romance, tragedy, comedy, and satire. And these are literary categories that he's trying to analyze narrative text. So that becomes extremely important. Or you take philosophy. Now, philosophy has had very little to do with literature in conceptual terms, but in more recent times, thanks to the work of scholars like Richard Rorty and so on, philosophy and literature have come together. For instance, Rorty thinks that there's a very, very close connection between philosophy and literature, and he focuses on writers like George Orwell, Nabokov, and Milan Kundera in his writings to show how significant they are in terms of their philosophical outlook. So philosophy has seen the impact of literature. Or you take geography. Now, geography is one discipline that you would normally associate with literature. But in more recent times, with the rise of human geography and cultural geography, with the work of people like Edward Soja or Derek Gregory, you begin to see that the literary imagination is making important inroads into the territory of geography. And that has made very important changes, transformations in the field of geography. So history and literature have come together. Anthropology and literature have come together. And now you see geography and literature coming together. Let me take one more example. Law. I mean, law is the last discipline that you would associate with literature. But in the new discipline of critical legal studies, you have lawyers, legal scholars arguing that in the construction of narratives that lawyers do, you have to use literary analysis, language, tropes, and so on. So that the critical legal studies also has displaced the impact of literary theory. So the point I'm trying to make is that the literary turn has had a big impact in both the humanities and the social sciences. Now, against this background, I would like to talk about cultural studies, which is the sort of main topic of my discussion this morning. Now, cultural studies is a new field of inquiry. It is interdisciplinary. It draws on a variety of disciplines: sociology, anthropology, history, philosophy, literature, feminist studies, communication studies, media studies, and so on. The strength and the weakness of cultural studies is it's too big. It encapsulates so many different disciplines that it lacks a focus in many ways. But on the other hand, it gives a kind of flexibility that other rigid disciplines do not have. So whatever it is, the interdisciplinarity is one defining feature of cultural studies. Another is that it has a distinct political edge. Cultural studies is nothing if not political. When I say political, I'm not speaking in terms of party politics. I'm speaking in terms of how power is distributed in society. So it has a clear, distinct political edge to it, which is extremely important. Cultural studies, to my mind, is also an interventionist discipline. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is we as scholars, as students of cultural studies, intervene in what we are studying. We are unafraid to take sides, because normally the positivistic sociologists would say you have to be neutral, you can't take sides. But the cultural studies scholars would say, no, you have to take sides. Don't be afraid, because if you are convinced of what you are saying is true and significant and consequential, why not lay down your cards and exactly point out what you want to achieve? So therefore, the intervention is important. Another is cultural studies deals with the everyday life, not some extraordinary things. It sees extraordinary things in ordinary life. Everyday life is very important. And in more recent times, scholars like Michel Liceteau or Pierre Bourdieu and so on have pointed out the importance of everyday life. And cultural studies scholars are constantly underlining the importance of everyday life. Another is that cultural studies deals largely with industrial societies. Anthropology traditionally dealt with rural villages. Anthropologists went to remote villages, studied those villages, and brought back the results. But cultural studies scholars are much more interested in industrial society. Although I must say the situation is changing with anthropology. In more recent anthropology, for instance, in a work like Critical Anthropology now by George Marcus, they are studying contemporary society. The places that they work is subject to ethnographic analysis. So therefore, that distinction is not that clear-cut and pronounced. But still, it is industrial society that attracts the attention of cultural studies scholars. Then the pop culture is very important, popular culture. Popular culture has traditionally been ignored by the humanities scholars as well as societies. For instance, literary scholars paid scant attention to popular culture. They studied elite culture, Shakespeare and Thomas Hardy and Dickens, but they didn't study Tarzan. But things have changed very much. And now popular culture has become very important. And there are very many implications of this, the study of popular culture, because traditionally you have elite culture and folk culture, and now you have popular culture, which is not only an economic force, but is a cultural force, but also it gives meaning to life. It tells people how to behave and so on, so that popular culture is a very important facet of human existence. And cultural studies people are quick to seize on that. That becomes important. Another is that cultural studies is self-reflective. That is to say, they always question the legitimacy, the efficacy, the validity of what they are doing. They don't pretend to be objective. They are subjective, but they are also questioning, am I on the right path? Is this of some consequence? Is this of some value? They're constantly looking back on themselves introspectively and raising questions that have great self-reflective value. So that is another important aspect. Then the idea of power and agency. Normally in social sciences and the humanities, we don't study questions of power in that detail. But in cultural studies, it's central, largely due to the influence of Michel Foucault and others. Power is a central concept in human society. Power is not a property that one group has and the other doesn't. According to Foucault and cultural studies scholars, power is rampant in society. It is both positive and negative, so that it's a much more complex notion of power and human agency that you find. And that, I think, is again quite important. Then the relationship between theory and practice. In most disciplines, there's a clear disjunction between theory and practice. But in cultural studies, there's a very clear linkage, connection between theory and practice. Theory informs practice and practice instigates theory. That becomes important. Then the idea of contextuality is again an important factor. Cultural studies is nothing if not contextual. By contextual, what I mean is the objects of study are linked to historical, social, political, cultural events. So the contextuality becomes important. Another is the interplay between the nation and the transnational forces are significant, because cultural studies have to be studied in terms of the nation. It's true. I mean, you cannot get away from that. But you must not restrict the study to the nation alone. You have to go beyond that, because in terms of global finance and so on, the nationalist boundaries are becoming more porous, and you've got to go outside, so that the transnational becomes important. So the cultural studies scholars are trying to balance the nation and the transnational in that sense. Another important point about cultural studies is that it is open-ended. It's evolving. It's not something mute and it's not final. It is constantly evolving, but the statements we make are tentative, provisional. They are partial in both sense of the word. Partial in the sense not full, partial in the sense it is subjective. So that the open-endedness becomes important. Another is the cultural studies scholars speak from the margins, not from the center, not from the establishment. They love to speak from the margins so that they can be critical of the establishment. Unfortunately, after cultural studies migrated to the United States, part of that has been lost, but still it is important. Then cultural studies scholars are not satisfied with the existing critical vocabularies and terms of reference and frames of understanding. They are trying to come up with newer vocabularies and frames of intelligibility. So that again gives them an opportunity to be involved in a quest for new territories, and that is quite central to their endeavor. So what we have is a discipline that is trying to balance between the cognitive and the affective. That's very unusual, because in most disciplines, both in the humanities and the social sciences, you focus on the cognitive. But here, cognitive is important, but at the same time, the affective is also important. By affective, what I mean is emotion or feelings, but not merely that. Feeling as it leads to knowledge. So it's not just feeling or emotion in isolation, but it is feeling or emotion as it paves the way to knowledge, to cognition. So that this is something distinctive about cultural studies, the combination of cognitive and the affective, that becomes important. So in order to understand the nature and significance of cultural studies, we have to have some sense of the models that exist at the present time. The most obvious model is a British model. Cultural studies was established in England in 1964 at the University of Birmingham at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. The first director was Richard Hogarth, and the first associate director was Stuart Hall. Now, what is very interesting is Richard Hogarth was a literary scholar who had an interest in sociology. Stuart Hall was a sociologist who had an interest in literature. So you have the coming together of the humanities and the social sciences at the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. So that's one. But this school of thought migrated to America and a lot of changes happened. It lost its political edge, but it became far more abstract and it began to involve itself in postmodernism, post-structuralism. And in a sense, it was marked by a retreat into theoretical elitism, so which is very unfortunate because the original founders of this project were down to earth, had very much practical issues in mind. So that becomes important. And of course, the most dominant model still is a British model. It was modified in America, in Canada, in Australia, and so on. But there were other models that were in existence. In the 1930s, in Japan, there were certain Marxist-oriented scholars who were trying to understand popular culture in Japan. That had a kind of cultural studies thrust to it. Or in Latin America, there's a debate, of course. Some say Latin American cultural studies was influenced by the British model, but others say, no, it's homegrown. They grew out of their own movements and their own concepts and so on. But still, you have the Latin American model. But still, the most important model is the British model. Another is that the African American and the Americans are, some scholars are trying to come up with a different set of understandings regarding cultural studies. So in order to understand the nature and significance of cultural studies, it's good to keep these models in mind. It is against this background, I would like to very briefly talk about the limitations, because if we are to know a discipline well, we must not only know its strengths, but also its limitations. In the case of cultural studies, I would like to identify a number of limitations. One is it's Eurocentric. Cultural studies is largely Eurocentric. If you see the scholars, they come out of Europe, and their methodologies, their themes of interest, their vision, it bears the imprint of European culture. So therefore, it's very important to change the Eurocentric focus. That's one. Another is that, as I said, the disjunction between theory and practice becomes alarmingly large. So we need to somehow bring them closer together, theory and practice, because the original founders were very keen to keep the connection between theory and practice close. So that becomes an important element. Then the interventionist model, again, we have to regain that interventionist impulse and make cultural studies a discipline that is one that offers resistance to mainstream thinking. At the same time, cultural studies has become very trivial because we are trying to deal with popular culture. It's very easy to slip into banality and triviality, and that has happened, which is unfortunate. So we got to be very careful that it doesn't become trivial. Then again, that it has become too capacious, so that it lacks a focus. So we have to be very careful about keeping a very distinct focus in mind. Then again, the pedagogical issue is very important. Cultural studies, after it migrated to the United States and other countries, became much more interested in the pedagogical aspect rather than the political aspect. But if there's a way of trying to combine the political and the pedagogical, then I think that will be of great significance. So that's something that's important. In other words, it is both a critical discourse and a political project. We have to keep both sides in mind. Then the idea of indigenousness, because so far we've been heavily influenced by European thought and European ideas and models. Is it possible for us to establish some links with indigenous modes of thinking and indigenous roots, indigenous sensibility? It's a matter worth considering, because that is one countervailing force to Eurocentrism. So the cultural studies was always seen as a counter discourse, speaking from the margins. But now, after it went to America, it has been established by communication departments, mainstream departments, so that it has become professionalized, it has become standardized, it has become institutionalized, and along with that, it has become commodified, which is very ironical, because one of the chief enemies of the early cultural studies scholars was commodification. But now commodification has become a friend and an ally, which of course goes against the whole thrust of cultural studies. So we have to be on our guard against these different changes. Now, against this background, very quickly, I want to refer to a few theories that you might want to keep in mind. One is Raymond Williams, who was my teacher at Cambridge, wonderful man. And he's done very important work in trying to show the connection between Marxism and culture, and how culture operates within the everyday life and social formation. So Raymond Williams and his book, Culture and Society, published in 1958, which is before the establishment of the Birmingham Cultural Center, is important. Second is Stuart Hall, who's a Jamaican by birth, and who was later to become the director of the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies. And he expanded the scope of cultural studies by bringing in the French structuralist Marxist Louis Althusser and the Italian Marxist Gramsci. And he widened the discursive field of cultural studies by doing that. Then we have the American scholar Lawrence Grossberg, who has tried to engage modern postmodernist, post-cultural, post-structuralist theories in order to give a sharper focus to cultural studies. Then you have Walter Benjamin, the German cultural critic. He died in 1940, he committed suicide actually in 1940. But what he wrote in the 20s and the 30s are now being reinterpreted in modern light as very important work for cultural studies. So Walter Benjamin becomes important. Then Michel Foucault, I referred to earlier, with his ideas of power and so on, becomes central. And Pierre Bourdieu, his an analysis about class distinctions and taste and the production of culture. These are issues that modern scholars of cultural studies can pursue profitably. And finally, one more, Roland Barthes, especially in his book, Mythologies and Empire of Science, have much to offer to cultural studies scholars. So these are some of the theories. So it is against this background. Now, what our task is to make cultural studies relevant to us, make it our own field of inquiry. How can we do that? We should get away from the Eurocentricity. Two, we should recognize that coloniality is the untranscendable horizon of analysis. In other words, we cannot get away from colonialism. The theories that I've spoken about so far did not engage colonialism. It is up to us to engage with colonialism and make it a very important reference point in the study of culture. So cultural studies and post-colonial theory has to come together in very significant ways. Another is we cannot bodily lift the Western culture theories and study our schools and universities, because there's a change that needs to be made. We need to come up with a new discursive terrain. Let me give one example. Martin Wickramasinghe has written extensively, both in Sinhala and English, on culture. Now, for instance, when he says Gami Sanskrutiya, he is using that both as a descriptive and a prescriptive term. It carries certain normative values. It carries certain valorizations. For him, Gami Sanskrutiya is pure. It is flexible. It is humane. And it is accommodating. All these important values are preserved in the term Gami Sanskrutiya. But if you take the word culture in the Western concept, it is seen as a site of struggle. It is a conflictual concept where struggle for meaning is taking place incessantly. Culture is a site where the meanings are made, unmade, and remade. So it's a very different concept from Martin Wickramasinghe's, and how do we square the two? So these are some important issues that we need to keep in mind. So for us, I think at this point, we might draw on the Indian experience. Now, there are a number of Indian scholars whose work can be brought into the study of cultural studies. They would be the first to say what they're doing is not cultural studies. But I would argue that what they are doing is of great value to us as scholars interested in cultural studies. I have names of people like Gayatri Spivak, Homi Baba, Ashish Nandi, Arjuna Padure, Deepesh Chakravarti, Partha Chatterjee, and Veena Das. I know most of them, and I work closely with them, and I know their strengths and how they can contribute significantly. For instance, Homi Baba and Gayatri Spivak have done excellent work on post-colonial theory. They are not awfully fond of cultural studies, but they have done excellent work on post-colonial theory, and that can be brought into our analysis. Similarly, Ashish Nandi has done wonderful work on the study of nationhood, reason, and rationality, science, nationalism, and modernity. And these have great value for us as students of cultural studies. Veena Das, for instance, is a sociologist, but at the same time, she draws on the work of ordinary language philosophers like Wittgenstein and Stanley Cavell. And in addition, I know this for a fact, she is a great Sanskrit scholar, and she draws on the Sanskrit philosophers of language. So she comes up with something that is both Eastern and Western, and that is an ideal that I would very much like to propagate. So the combination of the East and the West that you find in Veena Das is something that we in Sri Lanka can draw inspiration from. So the Indian experience is important. It is against this background, I want to suggest a few themes that you might pursue. One is something from the humanities side. Let's take the Vesantara story. It's very popular in Sri Lanka. It is in the Butsarana. It's a chapter in the Butsarana. It is a popular folk poem. There's a play by John De Silva on this story. Sarachandra wrote a play on the classical play on the Vesantara. There was a popular film made on the Vesantara. In popular songs, there are many popular songs dealing with the Vesantara story. So what you find is, you find the same unitary story being expressed, receiving articulation in different genres and different cultural contexts. So that's a wonderful topic for a cultural studies scholar. Or let's take something from the social science. Let's take the relationship between secularity and religiosity in Sri Lanka. We normally tend to think of these in opposing terms, which is true so far as it goes. But you also have to bear in mind the fact, as Talal Lasard and so on have pointed out, secularism grows out of religion, and religion grows out of secularity. There's a very complex interplay, and that's wonderful territory for cultural studies scholars. Or let's take another example, rituals. Some of our most eminent anthropologists have worked on rituals, and they have done so within the context of cultural anthropology. But we can widen that into performance theory and bring ritual into our analysis in many interesting ways. Or let's take one more example, nationalism and vigilance, right? Nationalism and vigilance are very closely connected. When you say nationhood, Benedict Anderson says it's an imaginary community. Ernest Gellner says it grows in industrial societies. Tony Giddens says that it's a product of modernity. Homi Baba says nations are narrated into existence. And here comes our own writer, Gurudas Amarsekara, and he has been severely criticized for this, saying that nationhood can be understood as a civilizational concept. So there are different ways of seeing the nation, and how can we study nation and the relationship to violence. One more, and it's a kind of contemporary topic. Most of you have heard the sensational song, Manike Mage Hite. Now, that became a sensation. It became very popular in England, in China, in India, Middle East, and so on. It's a Sinhala rap song, but to understand the cultural discourse behind it, you have to understand the rap music in the 1930s in New York and how it migrated to England, and it became mixed up with the dance music of Punjab called Bhangra. And Bhangra gave it a new twist, and it became a site of resistance and so on. So there's an Asian connection coming into it. And here in this song, what you find is the rhythms of rap music being in collision with the Sinhala language. So something very interesting is happening about cultural globalization and commodification and so on. So that's again an interesting topic. So these are some of the topics that I have many more actually in mind, but because my time is up, I have to stop. But these are some interesting topics that one can pursue in terms of our own interests and investments. So once again, let me go back to what I was trying to say. My point is, humanities and social sciences are normally seen as antagonists, antithetical, but they can also be friends and allies, and they can be involved in a common quest for knowledge. And that has happened in the case of cultural studies. And therefore, I think it's very good for us as we celebrate the establishment of humanities and social sciences at the university level to think of the importance of cultural studies. Thank you very much.
බෙහෙවින්ම ස්තුතියි මේ මොහොතේදී සජීවීව සම්බන්ධ වුණු සම්මානිත මහාචාර්ය විමල් දිසානායකයන්ට එතුමන් ලාංකේය සාහිත්‍ය කලා අධ්‍යයන ශේෂ්ත්‍රවලට පමණක් නොව සංවේදන ශේෂ්ත්‍රයටත් මම හිතන්නේ මහත් දායකත්වයක් දැක්වූ ප්‍රමුඛ පෙළ විද්වතෙක් දිනේදී මම හිතන්නේ අපට ඉතාම සුවිශේෂී අවස්ථාවක් එතුමා මේ සභාව ආමන්ත්‍රණය කිරීම